Welcome all. I am Dibyendu, Assistant Professor of English at Lalgarh Government College. I welcome you to this third lecture, online lecture series. And this online lecture series is basically organized for our 6th students, final year students, and this is basically tailor-made for them. We have already 2 lectures on different topics like classical writings as well as detective fiction. Today is the third lecture series. This will be on partition narrative and it will be delivered by Professor Debasri Basu from Maulana Azad College. And I would request Professor Rahul Borua, our respected head of the department, to introduce our chief guest and inaugurate the process. Rahul, over to you.
Thank you, Doipayan. Uh, uh, Thank you, everyone, for participating here in this online lecture series. And I would like to welcome Professor Bosu, uh, who is currently teaching at Department of English, Maulana Azad College, Kolkata. And few words regarding uh, Professor Bosu. She completed her PhD from University of Calcutta, and she teaches British literature of 18th century, partition studies, Indian writings in English, Bengali, Hindi, and English translation, resistance literature, and popular literature. Her scholarly articles have been published by Journal of Commonwealth and Postcolonial Studies, University of Calcutta, University of Bardhaman, Vidyasagar University, Netaji Subhash Open University, Lady Brabourne College, Kolkata, Lit Journal, Middle Flight Journal, Cambridge Scholars Publishing, and Cafe Dissensus website. Two of her research papers are still in press, uh, and I would like Professor Bosu uh, uh, to start her lecture on partition literature as well as Alam's own house. And Rahul Borua from Lalgore Government College, Department of English, would like to thank Professor Bosu for for sharing her valuable time with us. And I think that, or I believe rather, that it would be beneficial for our students, particularly our 6th students. And over to Professor Bosu.
Thank you, Rahul. Good afternoon, dear students, and all those who are attending today's lecture. I hope you will be benefited from whatever little I have to offer you regarding this particular story. Now, since this lecture is specifically for students, I have decided to keep the title very simple. Let me start my presentation without any further delay. Please let me know if it's visible to you all.
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
And can you see the presentation, the first slide?
Yes.
Okay. So as you can see, the title of this presentation is Partition Literature with special reference to Dibyendu Palit's story, Alam's Own House. Now, as you perhaps know, this is an English story translated into English, but originally it was written in Bangla. And the Bangla title of this story is Alome Nijer Bari. Now, of course, before delving into the story in detail, let's talk about partition. I suppose most of you have read about the partition back in school in your history lessons. So let's recapitulate it very quickly. As you can see from this map, the western and eastern sectors of the Indian subcontinent were partitioned to form the two wings of West Pakistan and East Pakistan. in 1947. Though East Pakistan later gained its independence in 1971, and nowadays it's known as Bangladesh. As you can see from these arrows, movement of migrants and refugees took place both across the western border as well as the eastern border. Muslims from mainly eastern Punjab and other parts of North India, they moved to West Pakistan, whereas Hindus and Sikhs from West Pakistan, they moved to India. On the eastern side of the subcontinent, we find Muslims from West Bengal and in some cases even from Bihar. They moved to East Pakistan, whereas Hindus from East Pakistan, that is erstwhile East Bengal, they moved mainly to West Bengal, and also some other states like the various northeastern states of India. And later on, they settled in different parts of the country, including the Andaman Islands mainly. Some of them were also sent to Dondokaranno. Now, Dondokaranno is basically a forest region in modern day parts of Orissa, Chhattisgarh, and Andhra Pradesh. Now, coming to the next slide. Now, as you can see over here, you will find that this partition, the events which actually started prior to the partition in 1946, they led to a huge massacre as well as movement of human population. Why am I saying massacre? See, the exact death toll is still not known because not all the deaths were recorded in official history. But the approximation, it is close to 2 million people. 2 million people means 20 lakh people. They died. Either they were killed or they died due to disease, the exhaustion of the strenuous journey across the border, and associated reasons. And as far as the number of evacuees, migrants, and refugees are concerned, once again, we do not have any exact figure because it didn't really happen in one go. It actually took place in multiple waves. Still, the figure is more than 15 million. That is more than 1.5 crore people who moved across the border. And when I say that the exact figure is still not there for us, for scholars, especially for scholars of history, let me elaborate to you the reasons why we still don't have the accurate statistics. And here I would actually highlight the Bengal case, which is slightly different from the Punjab and the Western border case. Now, see, as far as the Western border was concerned, we find that more or less the population exchange was over by 1948. Whereas in the case of the Eastern sector, what started in 1946, late 1946, after the Noakhali riots in Eastern Bengal, it started with that. Then in 47, we had the partition, the official partition, and people started coming in waves, but it didn't stop with 47 or 48 for that matter. In 1950, there was a riot in Khulna. Khulna is located towards the southeastern part of East Pakistan, modern day Bangladesh. As a result, once again, Hindus had to cross the border and come to various parts of West Bengal. Then in 1964, we had the Dhaka and Narayanganj riots. Same thing happened. The religious minorities, that is the Hindus, once again had to run for their lives and come to West Bengal. And this process actually heightened during the period from 1969 to 1971. Why is that? Because this was the peak of oppression against minorities, both the religious minorities as well as linguistic minorities. Now here, let me tell you something about the linguistic minorities. Pakistan, if you see in terms of population, Bengalis were the largest linguistic community, yet Urdu was the official language. Bengali speaking population, they protested against this, as a result of which they had to face persecution. And it started with the Yahya Khan regime of 1969. General Yahya Khan was the general of the Pakistani military, and in 1969 he became the president of Pakistan. As you perhaps know, Pakistan has had a long history of military rule. Even before General Yahya Khan, we had people like General, I think it was General Y Khan. Once again, the same name. It was Ayub Khan. Yes, now I get it. General Ayub Khan, who had a similarly shady track record. Now, the reason I'm going through this elaborate detail of East Pakistan is because the story that you have in your syllabus, that is Alam's own house, Alame Nijer Bari, is actually set in the post-1970 era. That means it's not set immediately after the 1947 partition, but instead during the time when persecution against minorities, mainly religious minorities, was at its peak in East Pakistan from 1969 onwards. Now, before that, let's also take a quick look at partition literature in general. Now, what do we mean by partition literature? Of course, the various novels, short stories, poems, some dramas, and also a number of memoirs which were written on this particular theme. Now, coming to Bengal partition literature, I mean, since most of us are Bengalis and we are staying in West Bengal, so I suppose it's very natural to have a curiosity pertaining to partition literature from this corner of the country. Now, Bengal has a substantial literature written on the theme of partition, though not much of it is unfortunately known beyond our state borders. I'll come to the reasons later on. But first, let's quickly take a look to, some of the well-known novels which have been written on this particular theme. Some of you who are interested in reading novels in general might be familiar with some of these names. Let's take the case of Bokultala PL Camp. Now, this was a very well-known Bengali partition novel written by Narayan Sannal. Here, PL in the title actually refers to permanent loyalty camps. Okay, now see, when these partition refugees, they crossed the border and came to various parts of West Bengal, sometimes even the neighboring states like Bihar, both the state government as well as the union government, they set up various kinds of camps. Some were known as transit camps, some were just, temporary camps, whereas other camps were called PL, that is permanent liability camps. Now, what does this particular phrase imply? That these refugees were to become a permanent liability for the state. I do hope you detect a faint trace of a slightly, I would say, pejorative undertone to this nomenclature. It's almost as if the central government felt that these people were liabilities for the government. It also tells us about their approach to Bengal refugees. Now, I'm saying this because it's once again different from how the central government treated refugees from the western sector, mainly Punjabi refugees. Now, after Bokultala PL camp, we have once again a very famous Bengali novel titled Epar Ganga, Opar Ganga, written by Jyotirmoyee Devi. Now, this particular novel subsequently was translated into English, and the English title is The River Churning. Then we come to a couple of novels written by the very famous Shunil Gangopadhyay. I'm sure all of you have read at least some novel written by Shunil Gangopadhyay, perhaps the Kakababu Shontu series. Now, Shunil Gangopadhyay had written two partition novels titled Purva Poschim, which was translated into English as East West, and the second novel was titled Arjun, which incidentally has also been translated into English. And because Arjun is a proper name now, basically it's the name of the protagonist, the male protagonist. So the English title is also Arjun. Then we have Keapata Nauka, written by Prafullo Rai. Once again, this novel might be familiar to some of you because a few years earlier, Zee Bangla television channel had adapted this particular novel for the small screen, for the TV. Then we have Nilkantha Pakhir Khoje, a Bengali novel written by Atin Bandopadhyay, another very famous novelist. Then Bishad Brikho, written by Mihir Sengupta. It won him the Ananda Puruskar in 2004. Then we also have Dayamoyir Kotha. Now it has been translated into English as A Life Long Ago, written by Shunanda Shikdar. Now, of course, this is a very short list of Bengali novels. There are others which have been written on this theme, but not many of them have actually been translated into English, which is why they find a limited readership. Now that we have quickly gone through the list of names of Bengali novels, let's come to partition short stories. This is because you have partition short stories in your syllabus. Now, amongst short stories, we have Manik Bandopadhyay's story, Upay. Now, this particular story is in your syllabus, Vidyasagar University syllabus. It has been translated into English as The Final Solution. Then we have Pratibha Basu's short story, Dukul Hara, which has almost a similar plot line as Manik Bandopadhyay's Upay, that is Final Solution. And Dukul Hara has been translated twice into English with the titles The Marooned in one version and Flotsam and Jetsam in other version. Then we have Jyotirmoy Devi's Shei Cheleta, which has been translated as That Boy. Then there's a very famous story titled Joibo, written by Narendranath Mitra, which has been translated into English as Biological. Now, incidentally, Narendranath Mitra had also written another short story on partition, and later Satyajit Ray had adapted that particular short story for the big screen. Suppose you have heard of Mahanagar, which starred Madhavi Mukhopadhyay. Now, remember Madhavi Mukhopadhyay, she had played the role of the refugee woman. That particular story was written by Narendranath Mitra. Then we have a couple of stories by Ramapada Chaudhary titled Angopali and Porun Kanna. They were also later on translated into English as Embrace and the Stricken Daughter. Then Ramesh Chandra Sen's story, Pother Kata, which was translated into English as The Thorn in the Path. Then Nobendu Ghosh's story, Tran Korta, which was translated as The Savior. And also Prafullo Rai's Majhi, which was translated as Boatman. Now, incidentally, Prafullo Rai has a full collection of 12 stories which focus either on the partition or the legacy of the partition till the 1990s. This was later on translated into English by an Australian scholar, and he gave the title Set at Odds. Of course, this list is mainly to give you an idea of some of the better known partition short stories written in Bengali and also later on translated into English. Now, since you have Upay, that is final solution in your syllabus, apart from Alam's own house, I'll just add a couple of things regarding Manik Bandyopadhyay. See, Manik Bandyopadhyay is better known for his novels, like say Podda Nodhir Maji, but uh, you should know that Manik Bandyopadhyay has written on the partition in a number of stories. So it's not that Upay, that is the final solution, is his only short story on this particular theme. Okay? So let's now move on to something unique about the Bengali partition literature, which is not always seen in partition literature from the Western sector. And why is that? It's because of the unique quality of the partition experience that we have on this side of the subcontinent. I already told you that the partition experience was a very long one in the eastern sector of the subcontinent, unlike the west, which is why you will find Bengal partition literature actually spans close to almost 3-4 decades, that is starting from 1946 to almost the 1990s. That is certainly not the case as far as the the partition literature of the West is concerned, because there it spans mostly say 10 years, not longer than that. But here I have already told you, because of the repeated cycle of violence in East Pakistan, the people over here never could, get out of that feeling of insecurity, which also affected the authors, and it resulted in these writers coming up with novels and short stories on these themes even till the 1980s and also the 1990s. Now that we have established the background to both the historical partition as well as the history of partition literature in India, we will perhaps come to what is actually in your syllabus. That is the story Alame Nijer Bari, translated into English as Alam's Own House. I believe all of you have already read the story, both the Bengali version and the English translation. So, let's go through it very quickly. You know that this is written by Dibyendu Palit. Some of you might have heard of Dibyendu Palit. He is quite a name of repute English anthologies. A couple of these titles are The Golden Life and The Faces and Other Stories. His stories have been adapted for the theatre as well by very well-known names like Vijay Tendulkar. I suppose all of you have heard the name of Vijay Tendulkar. Silence, the Court is in Session is perhaps one of his better-known dramas. And of course, Tapan Sinha, our very own Tapan Sinha, who once again is better known as a filmmaker, but he had also adapted Dibyendu Palit's short story for the theatre. Now, Palit has been awarded with a number of awards like the Ananda Puroshkar given by the ABP Group, then the Bomking Puroshkar, and of course the prestigious Sahitya Akademi Award. I suppose all of you know that this is the highest award given by the central government for contribution to the world of literature. Okay? Now, in the story, we find that at the beginning, Alam is flying. He's on a plane from Dhaka to Kolkata. Apparently, he is coming to the city to attend a seminar organized by the Maitri Sangh. Okay. Now, Kolkata is his city of birth. So obviously, he held a deep attachment to this city, and there was an additional reason as well. He hoped to marry Raka. Now, who is Raka? Raka is a young girl, and Alam and Raka had come to know each other when their families had exchanged their houses some years earlier. Now, incidentally, such exchange of houses is one of the chief traits of the partition experience, both in Bengal as well as in Punjab. As far as Bengali partition literature is concerned, we find a reference to a similar exchange of houses in Prafulla Rai's short story, Shikar. Remember earlier I told you about that anthology, Set at Odds, that contains this particular story, Shikar. The English translated title is Roots, where we find that the two protagonists, Rajmohan and Abdul Karim, they had exchanged their houses. Okay. So, I mean, this is something which was quite common, but of course, it was only limited to a certain socio-economic class. And why was that? Because even exchanging of property, houses, but not always very easy during that period of turbulence. So what we observe is that such transactions were mainly confined to the upper class people and sometimes the middle class people, sometimes. Certainly not the lower classes. Why? Because they simply didn't have the resources, the knowledge to carry out these transactions. Now, mostly houses were exchanged. In very few cases, I suppose even agricultural land were also exchanged, but as I've said, it was not that common. Okay? Now, people belonging to the upper and middle classes, they obviously got the news of what was going to happen much earlier in most cases, which is why they were prudent enough to make these transactions at the opportune moment. And also, as I've said, they had the wherewithal, the resources to carry out these exchanges. As you will see from the story, Alam's own house, people like Alam's father, he was a physician. Raka's father, Ananta Shekhar, once again, a well-established person. So, I mean, they could exchange their properties without much difficulty. Moving on, what do we find here? See, Alam's father had exchanged the property, his house, not immediately after the partition, that is 1947. If you read the story carefully, you will find that he took this decision much later, in 1970. Now, what could be the reason for taking such a sudden decision? And that too almost, let's say, 27 years after the partition. 47, 57, 67, 70, 23 years after the partition. What happened? What was the triggering cause? Once again, we'll have to go back to the history of Bengal, both West Bengal as well as East Pakistan during 1970. Earlier, I had told you that oppression started against the Hindus of East Pakistan from 1969 onwards. Actually, it was always there on a low key, but it actually peaked during those 3 years, from 69, then 70, and finally 71, the year when finally Bangladesh was liberated after the war, the Bangladesh War of Liberation. Okay. Now, something happened during this period from 69 to 70, which had made Alam's father feel the winds of change. Now, here I am reading a particular quotation from the text. Partition had taken place in two forms, one political and the other mental. The second one had not been sealed and signed by Mountbatten. End quote. The page number given here, 459, is actually from the version translated by Sarika Chaudhary and included in the Basu Fraser edited anthology titled Bengal Partition Stories. Okay, I've shared this edition with your teachers, so you can perhaps have a look at this. Let's come to the second sentence of this quotation. Alam's father says, the second one had not been sealed and signed by Mountbatten. That is, he is referring to the last Viceroy of India, Lord Louis Mountbatten. Now, he says that Mountbatten had effected the political partition of the land, but the mental partition had taken place amongst Indians. The British didn't really have much to do with that. And it is this partition of the mind which will be our main focus in the remaining part of our discussion. You see, how does partition of the mind affect people? We learn about it soon when we notice the changes that are visible to Alam's father during this period. And what was that? See, Alam's house was located in Park Circus. Those of you who have visited Kolkata will perhaps know that Park Circus is basically a centrally located area of Kolkata near Park Street. Incidentally, Alam's father had built a two-story house, and that was the first two-story house in that entire neighborhood. That means, of course, I mean, he was someone very well off in that neighborhood, and because he was a physician, a doctor, he was highly respected. But then something happened, and in 1970, one day, all of a sudden, he decided to give up his medical practice. I'm reading from the text. He shut down his surgery. Unless it was absolutely necessary, he stopped going out on calls. End quotation. That means what? He no longer felt the urge to carry on with his medical profession. Now, what could be the reason? It's not that he had been attacked. He was not hurt physically. So his son, Alam, at that time was quite unaware of the reasons. In fact, in the story it's written that he didn't know that a demographic change had occurred in the patient profile of his father. And what do we mean by patient profile? The background of the profile. In this case, of course, the author is focusing mainly on the religious affiliation of the patient. Okay. Now, as Alam's father, he explains to his compounder, and here I once again quote, earlier I used the same stethoscope for Ram and Jamal. Those days are gone. There are no Rams among my patients anymore, only Rahims. No Jodus, only Jamals. No Kanais, only Kareems. Ram, Jodu and Kanai have all gone to Dr. Gupta. We had our medical degrees from the same college, and we had learnt the anatomy of the same human being. The dissected body of that human being had no name labeled onto it. End quotations. So I hope you realize that this was the reason which was rankling Alam's father. The fact that there had been a very perceptible change in the patient profile. Hindu patients no longer visited him, but instead went to Dr. Gupta. So nowadays, he only had Muslim patients. Of course, he quickly adds that this is not a one-way trend. It's not that only Hindu patients had stopped coming to Alam's father. Dr. Gupta, who was a Hindu physician, he too had experienced the same, which is why he shifted his chamber from Park Circus to Baliganj. Once again, those of you who have visited Kolkata would know that Baliganj is located in South Kolkata and it is predominantly a Hindu locality. So I quote from the text, Dr. Gupta has taken a chamber at Baliganj, which is a predominantly Hindu locality in South Kolkata. His patients have dwindled in this part of the town, that is Park Circus, where I suppose some of you know, we have a high concentration of Muslims. The Jamals and Kareems don't recover from his treatment anymore. They come to me, unquote. So you see, Alam's father realizes that this is actually a two-way movement. Hindus and Muslims are now choosing doctors not on the basis of a medical qualification, but instead on the religious affiliation of their physicians. Now, this didn't happen earlier. So what actually changed all of a sudden? Once again, we'll have to take into consideration the surrounding political environment. Of course, people in West Bengal, including Kolkata, they were aware of what was happening in East Pakistan, how persecution had increased starting from 69 onwards, 1969 onwards. That somehow did have a psychological impact on people living on this side of the border as well, which is why the Hindu patients, they started flocking to Dr. Gupta, whereas the Muslim patients, they felt that one never knows, perhaps Dr. Gupta, being a Hindu, might harbor some sort of ill feeling towards Muslims. So they felt it was perhaps safer to go to Alam's father. This is what is known as groupthink. Groupthink is actually a technical term which essentially means, adhering to herd mentality, herd, H-E-R-D, herd mentality, or perhaps pack-mindedness. I'm sure all of you have heard of packs, wolves run in packs. Rarely do you find a lone wolf. That means what? People, without really thinking whether their decisions are logical or based on rationality, simply follow what others of their community are doing. It's almost like blindly following others without exercising one's sense of discretion. And that had taken place during this period. Now, because Alam's father was a very sensitive person, he could no longer take this. And that most likely resulted in his decision to shut down his medical practice. And soon enough, he took an even drastic decision. Before that, let's talk of the previous year, that is 1969. The previous year, Alam's father had advised his elder son, who had gone to study engineering in Glasgow, to settle there, adding that technically there is no problem here at all. You won't have difficulty finding employment, but you might find yourself unemployed in matters of the heart, unquote. That means what? Alan's elder brother, he had gone to Glasgow. Glasgow is in Scotland, part of the United Kingdom. So Alam's father had advised his elder son to remain there, to settle in UK. Why? Because he might not find any difficulty in getting a job back in India. Of course, I mean, a UK returned engineer is much sought after. So employment won't be an issue, but he might face difficulties in matters of the heart. And at that time, his father's words held more of mystery than simplicity for Alam. That means Alam still couldn't understand why his father had advised his elder brother to stay back in United Kingdom. But I'm sure all of you have read the story, so you know his father's words do come true by the end of the story. Alam does face difficulties in matters of the heart. So his words sound almost like, an omen, a premonition. So what had happened was that Alam's father, he decided to wrap up the Kolkata chapter and move to East Pakistan. He basically says, here I'm quoting from the text, those who can are leaving for Pakistan, some for East Pakistan and some for West Pakistan. We should have gone too, probably. I can feel a kind of illness in the heart, unquote. So you see, the doctor himself is feeling a kind of illness in the heart, illness in the mind, not so much illness in terms of external symptoms. It's not that he had to face any oppression or any direct persecution, but still he felt as if there was some underlying discrimination. If not discrimination, then certainly kind of segregation. I have already told you the reasons why the political backdrop did affect social choices, as a result of which people started behaving in a particular way against their erstwhile behaviors, which we see very well manifested in the case of the patients, both Alam's father as well as Dr. Gupta. So he had exchanged his house with Raka's father, Ananta Shekhar. Now at that time, Alam had been a student. He was pursuing his MA degree, Master of Arts degree. Now, as it happened, Ananta Shekhar, that is Raka's father, he had extended an invitation to Alam to, stay in this same house when Alam informed his father that he won't be going to East Pakistan with the other members of his family. Instead, he would remain in Kolkata and complete his MA degree. Now, when Ananta Shekhar hears, Alam's decision to stay back, of course, he very promptly comes up with this invitation, and he also actually gives the reason why. He says that I was desperate to find a house which I could exchange with my Dhaka house. So my need was more. Since Alam's family had agreed with this exchange. So this was Ananta Shekhar's way of showing his gratitude towards his family. Now this actually turns our attention to the situation of Hindus back in East Pakistan in that era. See, Alam's father wanted to shift to East Pakistan, but there was no pressing need, which was not the case for Ananta Shekhar. His urgency was much more. Why? Because there he belonged to the religious minority community, and I've already told you, Hindus had to come up with such tactics to evade state persecution. during this period from 69 to 71. Of course, Bengali Muslims were also targeted, but not to the same degree as Hindus. Now, Alam very gladly accepts this invitation of Ananta Shekhar, and he had continued staying in this house even after he had completed his MA degree, almost a decade, almost 10 years. After his MA degree, because he was very good at his studies, he quickly got a job of a lecturer at a city college, and he continued there. But 3 years earlier, he suddenly had to close his, Kolkata chapter. He had to, wrap it up very quickly and move to Dhaka. Why? Because his father had passed away. Now remember, Alam's elder brother had settled in UK. Alam incidentally had two younger sisters as well. His mother was now a widow. Perhaps that was the reason why he, being the only son now, felt the responsibility to relocate to Bangladesh, because he felt his mother and his younger sisters would now be dependent on him. So, familial motives had prompted Alam to resign from his lecturer's job in Kolkata and moved to Dhaka. But even after going to Dhaka, he had maintained a close correspondence with Raka. You see, by this time, Raka and Alam had developed a love affair. Now, something happened during this period of absence. Now, you see, I'm sure you have heard of a couple of statements pertaining to love and distance. Sometimes it's said that distance makes the heart grow fonder. But we also, have this saying that out of sight, out of mind. Now, what we have in this story is neither but something in the middle. What had happened was that Alam had been away from Raqqa for 3 years at a stretch. In the intervening period, he did promise Raqqa that he would come to Kolkata to visit her, but that visit never really materialized. And Raqqa, of course, was waiting for Alam's return when he would come to Kolkata once again. But since this gap had turned initially from months to years and then 3 years, by that time she felt as if Alam no longer had a responsibility towards her, which is why in their recent correspondence, Raqqa, according to Alam, had sounded rather cryptic. Now, why is that the reason? Because Raqqa had said that Alam had been promising to come to Kolkata for a long time. He had been regularly writing letters, and almost in most of his letters he did make this promise, but he never really fulfilled this promise. And this time also he was coming to attend a seminar. It's not that he was coming solely to visit Raqqa. That had slightly changed the equations between these two. And Raqqa's changed tone in her last letter did make Alam grow anxious. So basically what happens is, when Alam finally arrives at the place, he still considers it his own place. But as we all know, some changes have indeed taken place. He couldn't really detect the weakening of the ties which had happened in the last 3 years. So, what do we find? He is about to receive a series of jolts. Why? Initially at the airport, Alam had hoped that perhaps Raka would come to receive him. When that is not the case, he feels a bit disappointed. Still, after dropping his academic associate Firoz to a city hotel, he takes the taxi and heads straight to Park Circus. Why Park Circus? That's where his house was located. Now, when he rings the bell, he finds that the residents of the house were not really expecting him. In fact, Ananta Shekhar, that is Raka's father, clearly expresses his surprise. And he even says that Alam had not informed him that he would be staying at this place, that he would be directly coming to Park Circus to stay with them from the airport. I mean, that is enough to make Alam understand that his visit was not really expected. But of course, Raka's mother, Sneha, whom he addressed as Sneha Mashima, she was, very quick to control the damage. And she promptly says that, well, it's natural that Alam would come over here because this is the only home he knows in Kolkata. I mean, he has stayed only in this place. He had not stayed in any hostel. Even after getting a job, he had not stayed as, say, a paying guest, or he had not rented his own accommodation. So, I mean, for Alam, the only house that he knows in Kolkata, the only home is, of course, this Park Circus house. So it's most natural that he would come over here. And she quickly cooks a lunch for Alam, and then she points to him the guest room. Now, don't you think that this is quite an irony, that Alam, who was born in this house and who had grown up in this house for so many years, almost 3 decades, is now being delegated to the position of the guest? Well, he does realize the irony of the situation, and he's also, quite taken aback when he learns that Raka is not here. She is out of station. In fact, she's in Delhi visiting her elder brother who stays there. But Sneha Mashima, she does inform that there is a possibility that Raka might return the next day. Possibility. She is not certain. That means Raka's return date is not fixed. So, I mean, usually she takes the Kalka mail from Delhi. So, because she hasn't returned that day, so in all likelihood, perhaps she's going to come the next day. But it's a matter of suspense. Alam is kept in a state of suspense for the entire day, and when that night, when he's about to retire to bed, Sneha Mashima, she walks into his room, and she makes a revelation in a slightly changed tone. To Alam, even her voice, it sounds different, which is why we have in the story this particular phrase, in a very different voice. She, blurts out something that she couldn't have said in the presence of her husband, Ananta Shekhar. And what was that? That Alam shouldn't harbor any hopes from Raka regarding marriage. Why? Because it won't be possible for her to carry on with this relationship any further. And at the same time, Sneha Mashima also hands over a letter to Alam, which Raka had left before her departure for Delhi. Now, In that letter, Raka gives the reasons for her absence. She did know that Alam was coming to Kolkata. In fact, before his journey, before his flight, Alam had written two letters, one addressed to Raka and the other addressed to Anantashekar and Sneham, that is Anantashekhar's wife, informing that he would be coming to Kolkata for attending a seminar. Now, he did not specifically mention that he would be staying at this Park Circus residence because I suppose he almost took it for granted that because he is coming to Kolkata, it's natural that he would be putting up there. But now Alam realizes that what he had taken for granted was perhaps, you know, uh, a miscalculation on his part. Now, Raka informs in that letter that she had left Calcutta and gone to Delhi specifically to evade any awkwardness. Now, I would like to read a part of the letter that Raka writes to Alam. And of course, I mean, you have read the story, so I suppose you do know. But the reason why I'm reading out this particular quotation is because it actually explains Raka's reasons, the causes which had made her shift her allegiance. Okay? Now, basically, what happens is that there's a particular phrase in Raka's letter which mentions about a wall. You know, all of you know a wall. Now, in that letter, Raka had referred to the wall which had come up because of their different religious affiliations. Perhaps a related aspect is the fact that Alam had relocated to another city. Of course, this is a matter of speculation, but perchance Alam had continued to live in Kolkata. It would have happened that he and Raka would have eventually married because after all, both Raka as well as Alam are quite liberal minded. Otherwise, Raka wouldn't have entered into the relationship with Alam in the first place. But because now Alam had moved to Dhaka and he expected that Raka would one day marry him and come over to Dhaka, whereas Raka felt that Alam would perhaps return to Kolkata. This cross purpose, this gap in their expectations out of each other, that ultimately led to the final split between the two. And remember, earlier I had told you that I'll be quoting a certain section from Raka's letter. Raka says, it was because of this hesitation that our addresses have changed, yours and mine, and many people's before us. Address means she's specifically referring to the homes that Alam's family no longer lives in India now. They have moved to Bangladesh. Raka's family no longer lives in Eastern Bengal now. They have moved to India. As a matter of fact, she also refers to many peoples before us. See, they came to their respective places much later, 23 years after the partition of India. But in these 23 years, others have similarly crossed borders and settled in a different country, all for, perhaps feeling a sense of security. In fact, in the story, it's mentioned that Raka's extended family, many of our relatives, are now settled in various parts of India, like Pune, like Ahmedabad, and of course Raka's elder brother who stays in Delhi. Now, this is a fact. I've already told you. Most Bengalis from Eastern Bengal and later on East Pakistan, they mainly came to West Bengal, but many of them also settled in different parts of the country. And this movement had started even prior to the partition, that is from 1946. And in the short story that Dibyendu Palit writes, he makes a very pointed reference to 1946. Of course, he doesn't elaborate, but I suppose all of us know that 46 actually refers to the Noakhali riots and its aftermath, its bloody aftermath, when people had to flee for their lives because there was a lot of bloodshed, and women were raped, abducted, forced to uh, convert into Islam, which is why Noakhali, in a matter of days, seemed like a battlefront. Of course, it was a one-sided battle. Uh, the Hindus, being numerically a minority, had to face the brunt of this battle. So we find these societal causes becoming this unsurmountable wall, which eventually lead to the rupturing of ties between Alam and Raka. Now, as a matter of fact, let's get back to the title of the story. Now, of course, the story ends with the Alam's very grim realization that Raka has perhaps stopped expecting his return to Kolkata, which is why she has herself left Kolkata so that she can avoid any sort of unpleasantness. Now, this makes Alam also realize that the home which he considered his own is no longer his. See, the thing is that if you consider the Bengali title of this short story, Alome Nijer Bari. Now, what does this imply? Nijer Bari. For us Bengalis, Bari implies both house as well as home. In English, we have two different words, house and home, and they have different connotations. But as far as the Bengali language is concerned, we have the same word, implying both the senses. In fact, even if you take the Hindi language, you have two different words. One is makan for house and ghar for home. Mind you, the Hindi ghar is different from the Bengali ghar because in Hindi, ghar is home, whereas in Bengali, ghar is room. Okay, you have to keep these finer differences in mind. Now, Alam now realizes that the house, the home, the body, which he had considered his, even after his family had left Kolkata and gone to Dhaka, has now become a property of someone else. Of course, legally it had become a property of Ananta Shekhar much earlier, but he still considered the house and the residents of this house his own. But on this latest visit, he has to, take in the reality. He can no longer ignore the reality that is staring right in front of him. And this process of realization actually starts the moment he is about to enter into the house. Remember, he had directly come from the airport to Park Circus, and when he is about to enter the compound, he notices that the Kachapa tree, which was earlier there near the gate of that house, is now missing. Now, this Kachapa tree had a certain sentimental value for Alam. Why? Because it had been planted by Alam's father, so that the tree could be visible from both the stories of this house. So you see, it reminded him of his father. But now on this last visit, he finds that that tree has been, replaced by a shop, by a sweetmeat shop, Mishti Dokan. Still, he had brushed off the twinge of pain at seeing that shop. He had thought that perhaps necessity guided actions, which was why Raka's father, Ananto Shekhar, had probably put the open space to better use by building that shop. Even at that point, when he was about to enter the house, and he found that that Karchapa tree was no longer there, he knew something had changed, but he was not quite ready to accept that change. But once Nehamashima gives him that letter belonging to Raka and addressed to Alam, he can no longer stay in that mode of denial. He now truly understands that this house is no longer his, which is why even a few paragraphs earlier, what had happened was that Nehamashima, she had told Alam that the bathroom is that way. Once again, a height of irony, considering that Alam had stayed there for many years, for much more period of time compared to Nehamashima. So, he knew the layout of this particular house like the back of his palm. Still, I'm quoting from the text, you realize what Alam is going through now. Alam smiled. If one took account of the time Alam spent in getting to know each corner of the house, Neha hadn't spent even half of it there. Why? Because Neha had been here in this house for just 10 years, whereas Alam had been close to 30 years. But to have a right to it, of course, is a different matter. But Alam or any of his family members no longer had a legal right to this house. The property had exchanged hands, and Alam finally decides. He's forced to realize. It's not that he does this very willingly, but circumstances do point to a very unpalatable, painful, and yet at the same time a very palpable reality which he cannot ignore, which he cannot neglect any longer. That the house which was once his is no longer his. Nijer bari ar nijer roilo. So this is what the story is about. It is, I would say, a unique story in the sense that it charts the relationship of people not immediately after the partition, but perhaps the long lingering aftermath of the partition, and more importantly, the partition of the mind and the heart rather than the land. Now, as I've told you, this story has been translated by Sarika Chaudhary, which is the one which is prescribed in your syllabus by Vidyasagar University. But there is also another English translation that has been done by Debjani Sengupta. She is also a renowned partition scholar. She's a professor of English literature at Indraprastha College in Delhi. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because partition literature is something which we Bengalis need to be very careful about. Why? Because, of course, it's a part of our history. At the same time, it's a part of our legacy. And when these Bengali texts are translated into English, it's imperative that they stick to the original. Why? Because after all, partition literature is a part of historical literature, and we can't really take too much liberties with history. So, if you notice, I don't know whether you've had the opportunity to go through the version translated by Debasri, you will perhaps realize that some areas are slightly different. This brings me to another important point with which I'm going to conclude today's lecture is that, translating these texts should be a very responsible act, otherwise their credibility could get compromised. Why? I've already told you that people beyond our state lines, beyond the boundary of West Bengal, don't really know much about Bengal partition literature. And that's because very few of these texts have been translated into English. So it is a very something sacrosanct for us that we take the appropriate care to render it into English so that not just these texts reach a much wider readership, but also that we remain faithful to the original writers. I mean, as scholars, as Bengalis in general, I suppose this is our duty towards our writers and, of course, towards the rest of the reading populace. That's all for today. If any of you would like to ask me something regarding this story, you are free to ask now. You may place your questions.
Thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful lecture. This is indeed interesting, insightful, and incisive. We have one question till now from Gaurav Dash. He has asked, it is a question, or I think his observation, that his love and nostalgia was for Raka or only for that house doors stairs. So, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, well, I'm glad, Gaurav, you have raised this question. See, I mean, Alam definitely had a very deep bond with the physical aspect of the house. But that doesn't in any way undermine his relationship with Raka. If you read the story carefully, you will know that indeed he was deeply in love with Raka. I mean, it's not that his feelings were superficial, but you must at the same time realize that sometimes people have different goals, objectives in life. In this case, Alam felt that since he had relocated to Dhaka, perhaps Raka, would one day marry him and come over to Dhaka, as is the case in most places around the world where patriarchy has its way. Once the woman marries, she is expected to go to her husband's place. Whereas Raka, on the other hand, hopes that Alam would return to Kolkata. Perhaps she is not quite comfortable going back to Dhaka, even though now there has been a change in the political regime. It's no longer East Pakistan, but it's Bangladesh. Still, if you remember her father's mentioning that, there was a great urgency on the part of Ananta Shekhar to find a suitable home in Kolkata. That means what? It is quite clear that Raka, being a member of the Hindi community, perhaps did not feel quite at ease in Dhaka, even though it was now Bangladesh. So she was not quite ready to move, to go back to Dhaka. So you see, their goals in life had changed because of circumstances. And that's why the wall that she refers to in her letter becomes quite insurmountable. It's not that the feelings were not real. Sometimes, circumstances can get the better of a person and even relationships. Any other question?
Thank you, ma'am, for your answer. If anyone has any question, can unmute or can type it out in the chat box. Anyone? Students, scholars? Okay, so one question.
There's a question.
Ankita Shah has asked, can we consider the house as the microcosm of West Bengal, considering the psychological changes?
See, the house, in a way, could be a symbol of what doesn't move. You know, we have two kinds of properties, movable properties as well as immovable properties. In this case, the house, despite being an immovable property, sometimes, you know, overlaps with the people who are here forced to move. Now, as far as West Bengal as a whole is concerned, you will find different responses to the partition. While some people, you know, welcome these migrants from Eastern Bengal and East Pakistan, even latter day Bangladesh, with open arms, there was also a section who actually considered them to be a burden, almost like what the central government deemed these refugees to be, liabilities. So, Ankita, it is a bit, you know, difficult to categorize the entire state of West Bengal as the microcosm and, you know, correlate it with the house. But yes, the house definitely can be, you know, I would say regarded as a symbol, which though is immovable, is very much a witness to the changes and the movements that take place across the border from East Bengal to West Bengal and vice versa. It is certainly a witness, perhaps a mute witness, nonetheless a witness.
Thank you, ma'am. Any other question from anyone? Till now, ma'am, I have one question for you. That is, how is the concept of memory or the role of memory treated in this text? Because it is a
Definitely, yes, yes. If you read the text carefully, you will find Alam is virtually, you know, steeped in nostalgia. I mean, time and again, he reminisces about his days spent in that house. Even while he was flying, all those memories rush back to him. Now, one might consider, why is this the case? It seems Alam is still stuck in that phase that he had been living in for those 3 years when he had been in Dhaka. Physically, he was in Dhaka, but emotionally, but mentally, his mind, his heart was still in that house. Which is why Raka's reaction comes to him as a very rude jolt, because he hadn't been able to move on. Memory definitely plays a very strong role as far as Alam is concerned. Now the question is it the true for Raka as well? Raka, it seems, has moved on. But then we can't really blame her for that, because her condition is slightly different from that of Alam. Once again, I'm referring from the text. In one part of the text, after Sneha Mashima has handed over that letter to Alam, she says that your condition is better than ours. You can at least come to Kolkata whenever you feel like. But for us, the road has stopped. It has been blocked. We cannot go back to Dhaka even if we wish to. Now, one may raise a question, why is that the case? One can easily get a visa from the Bangladesh High Commission and visit Dhaka or other places. But you have to understand, people who have fled a particular place, it is not always very easy to go back to that place. Why? Because fear is a very strong motivation and it can actually lead to trauma, and that trauma in more cases actually is very long term. So for Raqqa, it is virtually impossible to go to Dhaka. Whereas Alam, he hasn't experienced such trepidation, such fear, such sense of insecurity in Calcutta, which is why it's very easy for him to, just get a visa from the Indian consulate in Dhaka and visit Calcutta. So there's a slight difference in circumstances as far as Alam and Raqqa are concerned. And, our circumstances, our sense of comfort, our degree of ease, that has a direct bearing on our sense of nostalgia. Sometimes, people want to shun painful memories, fearful memories. In the case of Alam, he had no negative memories associated with his house. This is why, on an emotional plane, he still continues to live over there. But unfortunately, that cannot, it cannot be really said for Raqqa, which is why their paths, they diverge at the end of the story. So yes, memory does have a very, potent role to play in the case of Alam.
Thank you, ma'am. One final question from my end. Frederick Jameson has said that protagonists in post-colonial writings are basically national allegories. So when we apply this remark to the domain of partition literature, can we say the same thing? Because we can see that the characters in the partition narrative, be it Bishen Singh in Tobatek Singh or Mollika in Final Solution, now can you say that they are actually representative of a community or a nation? Because through the characters, the journeys are also depicted to some extent. So
Yes. Definitely. This particular statement is very much applicable to these characters of partition literature. Why? Because these are not unique cases. It's not that Mollika is a one-off character. I mentioned about Pratibha Basu's short story Dukulhara, which has been translated as The Marooned, and also there's another version titled Flotsam and Jetsam. There we have the characters Uttara, who is almost in a similar position as Mollika in Manik Bandyopadhyay's Upar. She is also a refugee like Mollika. Initially, she puts up at a railway station, but just like Mollika, she falls a victim to a pimp, and eventually she is forced to join a flesh trade. So you see, people like Mollika, I mean, it's not that their lives are unique, their stories are unique. We have similar cases in literature, and of course, there are so many cases which are not recorded in history, but it has happened. As a matter of fact, Shialda station actually, it became a den for antisocial elements immediately after the partition. Why? Because these kind of people, pimps, other shady characters, they used to make a beeline for the Shialda station to pick their victims. So definitely they are very much representative of their communities. By communities, I don't really mean only religious communities, but in the case of, say, Mollika or Uttara in Pratibha Basu's Dukulhara, the women, the hapless women who were sucked into prostitution. So this particular statement by Jameson that most post-colonial characters, they can be read as allegorical figures, is very much applicable to these stories because, as I've said, I mean, they are characters in their own right, no doubt, but at the same time, they also symbolize what had happened with many belonging to similar socio-economic background.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I would request our YC sir, Professor Bisheshwar Chakraborty, to say a few things because he is the chief architect of today's lecture, and through sir we got to know ma'am, and this lecture series has been organized, which is very fruitful for our students. One question has come up. Ankita has asked, what caused uh, Ananta Shekhar's mental change? Is it only mental partition? It is so then, why he earlier allowed Alam to stay in that house?
Okay. Yes. A very good point, Ankita. Surely, I mean, Ananta Shekhar had been so courteous in extending that invitation to Alam to stay and continue his studies. So, what happened all of a sudden? See, the change has to be seen in the context of marriage. Sometimes we can appear to be very liberal in other spheres, but when something pertains to the personal, something as intimate as a marriage relationship, uh, then our criteria, our parameters can change. And this had happened not so much in the case of Ananta Shekhar because Ananta Shekhar was not really privy to how much deep the relationship was between Alam and Raka. But Sneha Mashima being the mother, mothers usually know more about these things. So Sneha Mashima was definitely aware. And as I've said, as far as Raka herself is concerned, she knew that she could never go back to Dhaka, no matter what her relationship with the Alam was. Now, Ananta Shekhar, you might say, sounds surprised. I mean, actually expresses his surprise. Not that he is angry or he shows his rudeness to Alam when Alam all of a sudden, appears in that house. But you have to agree that a gap of 3 years has changed the dynamics of their, relationship. The fact that Alam has made this visit after quite a long gap. 3 years is not a very short time. More specifically, if you consider the fact that Alam had, made such overtures in his letters to Raka. He did say of visiting Kolkata every now and then, but he never really kept his word. And this time also he was visiting because it was coinciding with the seminar organized by the Maitri Shankar. See, while we can't really, place the blame on either Alam or Raka or Ananta Shekhar for that matter, we do have to understand that uh, our behavior is constantly changing because of the flux in our circumstances. Rarely we stay in a state which remains intact in what is known as a status quo. And perhaps that's the reason why Ananta Shekhar, I mean, he cannot camouflage his extreme surprise at seeing Alam all of a sudden because uh, knowing about someone's visit to Kolkata and actually seeing him turn up at the front door to stay, these are two slightly different things. While Alam was certainly not unwelcome, it would have been perhaps better if he had mentioned specifically in his letter that he was going to stay over there, so that at least they could make arrangements, if not anything else.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I would request our YC sir, Professor Bisheshwar Chakraborty, to say a few things. Sir, over to you.
So at the beginning, I would like to thank Debasri for uh, such an informative talk on Alam's own house and pointing out very lucidly, rather in a very student-friendly manner, which is required for us. Uh, uh, required for us. And I also thank you for being agreed in such a quick time, in such a short time, to find a time for us and to deliver the talk. So I take the opportunity to thank our department as well. Doifan is there, Rahul is there, our students are there who have uh, who have been very punctual in coming to these sessions. Thank you, Doifan, for organizing and making all those things which are required for the design work and other things which are required for organizing this kind of talks. The students, you have been much benefited, I think, from the lecture series of the past instances and today's as well. And it will surely open up before you a new insights, fresh outlooks, how to look at texts, partition texts, because now you are reading only Alam's own house, but in future you will be reading more and more. And mark what texts have been mentioned. These are very basic texts who have been mentioned by Dr. Basu in her lecture. So I thank the students as well. I thank other students of our college as well as others who have come to join and posing beautiful questions which are very relevant to the theme as well as the context of the story. So this is my word. This is my words. I thank you all, and particularly again, I thank Debasri for making it very much available for us in such a short time. Thank you.
Thank you, Visheshwar. I mean, you have given me
Okay.
this opportunity. Because this subject is something very close to my heart, it's always a pleasure to speak on this topic. I just hope that the students have been benefited from this talk.
No, no, no. Obviously, I think actually what happens, they must think of it themselves, and they must, they will read themselves first. They have read for the first time this type of stories. In fact, it is for the first time they are now analyzing these stories in such a manner. So I think it will take time for them, but they will surely come up with uh, an analytical understanding of the texts which are there for them. So I
Okay.
obviously look for other opportunities when you will come to our college and deliver talks physically. Hope the pandemic is
Yes,
going
in the
to
post-pandemic era, we do hope that I mean we all
meet.
recover from this crisis as early as
Yeah.
possible.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So all of
Yes.
you, take care of your health, stay safe, and hope
Okay.
to
Okay.
meet
You
in
too.
better times.
Okay. 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 So
Thank,
Taipan, conclude.
thank you
Uh,
all. And I would request our head of the department, Rahul Borua, to say something, and also let the students know about the schedule for tomorrow, because we have two lectures scheduled for tomorrow. One is on Swami and Friends, and the other is on the Hound of Baskerville. So, Rahul, please say something.
Yes, tomorrow we have two lectures at 11 a.m. Professor Shobhan Maiki to deliver his first lecture, and then we have uh, Dev- Devodat Devan, can you
Devaditya Mukhopadhyay.
Devaditya Mukhopadhyay.
to deliver his lecture on Hound of Basker Hills. So for tomorrow we have two lectures, and I wish and I'll ask rather to participate in the lecture series for tomorrow also. And I would like to thank Professor Bosu for his enlightening lecture, and I think that students would be benefited from such beautiful lectures.